October 2, 1918. The Argonne forest breathes low and damp beneath a gray French dawn. Mist hangs between the trees, clinging to broken branches and shredded undergrowth. The ground is soft with rain and churned by boots and shell fire. Somewhere in the distance, German artillery thuds with a dull, methodical rhythm, not frantic, not rushed, patient. Along a narrow ravine, American soldiers of the 77th Division dig into the earth with bayonets and bare hands. Many are recent arrivals to war, clerks from New York, laborers, immigrants. Their uniforms are already stained dark with mud and sweat. They believe the units on their flanks are advancing with them. Orders said so. The maps said so. But as the morning wears on, something feels wrong. Runners sent downhill do not return. Signal flares rise and disappear unanswered. The sound of American guns fades, replaced by rifle cracks echoing from unexpected directions, from the sides, from behind. By midday, the truth settles in quietly, without announcement. They are no longer advancing. They are surrounded, and the decisions that led them here were set in motion long before a single boot entered the forest. By the autumn of 1918, the First World War had entered its final, most punishing phase. 4 years of industrial conflict had reshaped Europe into a continuous belt of trenches, wire, and artillery craters stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Entire regions of France and Belgium had been erased, villages reduced to chalk dust, forests stripped to splintered stumps. Millions were already dead, and millions more would never return whole. The United States had entered the war late in April 1917, but by mid-1918 its presence was no longer symbolic. American factories had begun to outproduce Europe. American troops were arriving by the hundreds of thousands. Fresh divisions, unbroken by years of attrition, were being fed into a conflict that had exhausted its original combatants. For Germany, this shift was existential. The failure of the spring offensive earlier in 1918 had drained the last reserves of German manpower. The gamble to defeat the Allies before American strength fully arrived had failed. Now the strategic balance had turned sharply. German commanders knew the war could not be won outright. At best, it could be delayed long enough to force political concessions. At worst, collapse was inevitable. The Allied response was relentless pressure. Beginning in August 1918, a series of coordinated attacks, later known as the 100 Days Offensive, pushed German forces backward along nearly the entire Western Front. The French pressed in Champagne, the British advanced near Amiens, and in September, American forces took on their largest and most ambitious operation to date, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Stretching from the Meuse River on the east to the dense Argonne forest on the west, the sector was one of the most heavily fortified regions in Europe. German engineers had spent years constructing layered defensive lines, concrete machine gun nests, interlocking fields of fire, deep dugouts protected from artillery, and carefully pre-registered kill zones. The terrain itself favored the defender. The Argonne forest was not a single stand of trees, but a tangled mass of ravines, ridges, and narrow valleys. Visibility was limited to a few dozen yards. Movement off roads was slow and exhausting. Command and control, already fragile in trench warfare, became almost impossible once units entered the trees. For the Germans, it was ideal ground to slow an advancing enemy. For the Americans, it would become a test of coordination, discipline, and endurance on a scale they had never faced. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, insisted on an independent American role in the offensive. He believed U.S. forces needed to fight as a unified army, not as reinforcements under British or French command. The Meuse Argonne would be their proving ground. Nearly 1.2 million American soldiers would eventually take part. Among them was the 77th Division. Unlike many American units, the 77th was not drawn from rural communities or long-established military traditions. It was composed largely of men from New York City: dock workers, tailors, office clerks, first-generation Americans who spoke dozens of languages between them. They had trained quickly, they had drilled hard, but few had experienced sustained combat. When orders came in late September 1918 for the division to advance into the Argonne, the objectives were clear on paper: push north, maintain contact with neighboring units, keep moving. What those orders did not fully account for was how quickly coordination could dissolve inside the forest, and how unforgiving the terrain would be once it did. Those conditions would shape every decision made in the days ahead, and they would determine which units emerged intact and which would vanish into the trees. The 77th Division entered the Argonne Forest under conditions that masked danger with momentum. In the final days of September 1918, Allied artillery battered German positions along the front. For hours, shells raked the forest, snapping trees and collapsing dugouts. When the bombardment lifted, American commanders believed the enemy line had been sufficiently disrupted. The assumption was simple and widely shared: German resistance in the Argonne would be scattered, disorganized, and retreating. That assumption would prove costly. The 77th Division was assigned a sector on the western edge of the American advance. Its task was to push northward through dense forest, maintaining alignment with French units on the left and other American units on the right. The doctrine was straightforward. Units were to advance on a broad front, staying in contact at all times. Gaps were dangerous. Isolation was fatal. But the Argonne did not permit clean lines. Paths twisted and vanished. Ravines cut units off from one another without warning. Runners struggled through mud and fallen timber, often taking hours to deliver messages that were outdated by the time they arrived. Field telephones, if they existed at all, were severed immediately by shell fire. In this environment, small unit initiative became the difference between movement and paralysis. Major Charles Whittlesey, a Harvard-educated lawyer turned officer, he was not flamboyant, not theatrical, but he was precise, disciplined, and intensely focused on orders. He had been instructed to advance aggressively and hold whatever ground he gained. On October 2, Whittlesey's battalion moved forward alongside elements of the 307th Infantry. Progress was uneven but steady. German resistance appeared sporadic. Enemy machine guns fired briefly, then fell silent. Prisoners were taken. The sense spread that the line ahead was weakening. What Whittlesey and his men could not see was what was happening on their flanks. French units to the west encountered heavier resistance and stalled. American units to the east were slowed by machine gun nests concealed deep in the ravines. The carefully planned alignment began to fracture. Gaps widened silently, measured not in yards, but in minutes, then hours of lost contact. By the evening of October 2, Whittlesey's battalion had advanced further than any unit on either side. They had followed orders exactly, and in doing so, they had pushed into a pocket of terrain the Germans had no intention of abandoning. German officers in the sector were not retreating blindly. They recognized the danger of an American penetration deep into their defensive network. Rather than counterattack immediately, they allowed the advance to continue,
then closed behind it. By nightfall, German machine guns were repositioned along the ridgelines. Infantry units moved through familiar forest paths, unseen. Artillery observers recalibrated firing data. When dawn broke on October 3, the Americans in the ravine discovered what the maps could not show. There were no friendly units within reach. Supply routes had vanished. Communication was severed. Ammunition was limited. Rations were already low. The battalion numbered roughly 600 men when the advance began. From this moment forward, every casualty would matter, and every decision would be made without reinforcement.
Encirclement is not announced, it is felt. For the men of Whittlesey's battalion, the first indication was silence. No runners returning, no voices from adjacent units. The distant thunder of Allied artillery that had once moved steadily forward now landed unpredictably, sometimes frighteningly close. Food became an immediate concern. Rations meant to last a day were stretched across several. Canteens emptied quickly. Water had to be gathered from shallow streams under fire, filtered through cloth, and swallowed despite the taste of soil and decay. Wounded men lay where they fell. There were no evacuation routes. Medics worked with what they carried on their backs. Morphine was rationed carefully. Bandages were reused. Infection set in quickly in the damp forest air. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by rifle fire and the knowledge that movement after dark could draw a grenade. Men whispered more than they spoke. Cigarettes became currency. Letters already written were read again and again. The battalion was not composed of seasoned veterans. Many had never fired their weapons in anger before entering the Argonne. Yet within hours they were forced to adapt to a reality in which hesitation meant exposure. Fear did not disappear, it narrowed. Each man's world shrank to the few yards of ground he could defend, and still they held. That human endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, and sustained under pressure, formed the foundation of everything that followed, because without it, no tactical decision could matter. The Argonne forest erased traditional battlefield geometry. Lines dissolved into clusters. Platoons became islands. Officers could not see beyond the next rise. Maps lost relevance the moment boots left the path. German forces understood this terrain intimately. They had occupied it for years. Machine gun positions were not built to dominate open ground, but to control narrow approaches. Fire was delivered from angles that seemed impossible, echoing through ravines in ways that confused direction and distance. Whittlesey responded by compressing his defense. Instead of attempting to re-establish a linear front, he ordered his men to form a tight perimeter along the ravine's contours. Fields of fire overlapped where possible. Ammunition was redistributed. Automatic rifles were placed where they could dominate likely avenues of approach. This was not doctrine as written, it was adaptation. German probes began almost immediately. Small units tested the perimeter, firing from cover, withdrawing, then returning from new directions. These were not reckless attacks, they were methodical, designed to locate weaknesses, designed to conserve German strength while bleeding the isolated Americans. Each repulse cost the defenders bullets they could not replace. But each failed probe reinforced a crucial fact. The battalion was still intact, and as long as it remained so, the Germans could not simply bypass it. The Americans were sitting astride key ground that threatened German rear areas if ignored. This forced a choice: commit more resources to eliminate the pocket, or accept the risk of leaving it alive. That choice would shape the next phase of the engagement, and it would bring leadership into sharp focus. Major Whittlesey did not attempt to inspire with speeches. He issued orders, calmly, precisely, without dramatics. His command style emphasized discipline and restraint. Firing was controlled, movement was deliberate. Panic was not tolerated, not through punishment, but through example. Officers remained visible. They shared the same dangers, the same hunger. When German messages arrived offering surrender, they were ignored. Not defiantly, not theatrically. They were simply not answered. Whittlesey understood the arithmetic of the situation. His battalion could not break out without suffering devastating losses. It could not expect immediate relief. But as long as it held its position, it fixed German forces in place, forces that could not be used elsewhere. Holding was not passive, it was an active decision, renewed hour by hour. As German pressure increased, the burden on leadership intensified. Orders had to be brief, clear, unambiguous. There was no margin for confusion. And beyond the perimeter, German commanders were adjusting their own calculations. They were beginning to realize that this pocket of American infantry was not collapsing as expected. That realization would lead to escalation, and escalation would test both sides beyond endurance. German commanders in the Argonne did not view the encircled Americans as an emergency. They viewed them as a problem to be managed. Years of trench warfare had taught German officers the cost of frontal assaults. The Western Front punished impatience. Success came from pressure, not spectacle, from attrition, not reckless bravery. Once the American battalion was identified as isolated, German units adjusted accordingly. Machine guns were repositioned to dominate supply routes that no longer existed. Artillery was calibrated to strike likely defensive clusters. Infantry patrols maintained constant contact, probing for signs of collapse. The objective was simple: exhaust the enemy. German officers believed time was on their side. The Americans were low on food, low on water, low on ammunition. Without reinforcement, surrender seemed inevitable. There was no urgency to storm the ravine. Instead, the Germans laughed at captured maps that still showed American units advancing in coordination. They mocked the idea of rescue through a forest that belonged to them. Confidence, not cruelty, shaped their approach. But what they misjudged was not American courage, it was American endurance. Each day the battalion remained intact, disrupted German assumptions. Resources allocated to containment could not be used elsewhere. Artillery shells fired into the ravine were shells not falling on advancing Allied units. The longer the pocket survived, the more inconvenient it became, and inconvenience, on an already strained front, carried strategic weight. Isolation on the ground might be endured. Isolation from command could not. Whittlesey attempted repeatedly to signal American artillery and headquarters. Runners were sent out through German lines. None returned. Field telephones were useless. Wires had been cut early in the advance. The battalion's position, once clear on planning maps, was now a rumor at higher headquarters. American artillery continued to fire based on outdated assumptions. Shells began to land inside the perimeter. Friendly fire inflicted casualties the Germans had not managed to achieve. Men were killed while sheltering from an enemy they could not see. Morale strained under the knowledge that rescue efforts were unintentionally adding to their losses. Only one option remained: carrier pigeons. The U.S. Army Signal Corps still relied on birds when all other communication failed. Several pigeons were released. Some were killed by gunfire. Others vanished into the forest. Then one remained, a small gray bird named Cherry Ami.
Attached to its leg was a message written under fire, stating clearly that American artillery was striking their own troops. The coordinates were precise. The tone was urgent but restrained. When Cherry Ami took flight, German riflemen fired. The bird was hit, but it did not fall. Hours later, the message arrived. American guns adjusted. The bombardment shifted away from the ravine. For the first time in days, the battalion was no longer under fire from its own side. That fragile line of communication restored something almost forgotten: connection. And with connection came the possibility of relief. By October 5th, the battalion had been encircled for days. Rations were nearly gone. Men scavenged from the packs of the dead. Water was shared by mouthfuls. Ammunition was counted shot by shot. The wounded lay silent, conserving energy. Medics could offer little more than reassurance. Infection spread. Fever followed. German voices could be heard in the trees. Sometimes they called out in English. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they promised safety. The offers were ignored, not because the men believed rescue was guaranteed, but because surrender meant abandoning the wounded, abandoning the position they had been ordered to hold. Morale did not rise, it hardened. The battalion's continued resistance was no longer fueled by optimism, it was fueled by obligation, to orders, to each other. And beyond the forest, American commanders were finally grasping the severity of the situation. Relief forces were being organized, but breaking through the Argonne would take time. And time was the one resource the lost battalion did not have. What followed would determine whether endurance alone was enough. October 6, 1918. The forest no longer felt like cover. It felt like a cage. German pressure intensified with a subtle shift in tempo. Probing attacks became coordinated assaults. Machine guns fired longer bursts. Artillery crept closer, measured not in salvos, but in deliberate corrections. The intent was clear. The period of observation was over. Shortly after dawn, infantry units advanced through the ravines, using dead ground and familiar paths. Grenades arced into shallow foxholes. Rifle fire snapped from multiple directions at once. The perimeter shrank as men fell or were forced to reposition. Ammunition was redistributed again. Automatic riflemen were instructed to fire only when targets were clear. Every decision carried weight. Then the artillery returned. Not German artillery. American shells began to fall inside the perimeter once more. Despite Cherry Ami's message, confusion at higher headquarters persisted. Maps were still inaccurate. The battalion's exact position remained uncertain. Fire missions intended to suppress German counterattacks landed among the very men they were meant to protect. The effect was devastating. Men were killed while sheltering from enemy fire. The wounded cried out, then fell silent. The ground shook with concussions that seemed to come from nowhere. Whittlesey understood the risk of signaling again. Another pigeon might not survive. Another message might not arrive in time. But inaction meant annihilation. A second message was prepared, clarifying their position and pleading for the bombardment to cease. It was brief, factual, desperate without dramatics. Again, a pigeon was released. Again, German fire followed it into the sky. This time, the bird did not return. Inside the perimeter, the battalion endured fire from both sides. The Germans pressed closer, emboldened by the chaos. Shouts echoed through the trees. Grenades exploded in quick succession. Several positions were nearly overrun before counterfire forced attackers back. By mid-afternoon, the German assault began to falter. Casualties mounted.
The cost of attacking into a determined, if starving, defense exceeded expectations. The Americans were not retreating, they were not surrendering, they were absorbing punishment that should have crushed them days earlier. Late on October 7th, the sound of unfamiliar gunfire reached the perimeter. Different cadence, different direction, American. Relief forces from the 307th and 308th Infantry Regiments had fought their way through the forest. Progress was slow, costly, but it was real. When contact was finally made, the men of the lost battalion did not cheer. They were too exhausted. They rose slowly. Some could not rise at all. Of the roughly 650 men who had entered the ravine, fewer than 200 were still able to walk out under their own power. The ordeal was over, but its meaning was only beginning to register, because what had occurred in that forest would echo far beyond the Argonne. The first reports of the lost battalion's ordeal spread slowly through the American command. Casualty figures were staggering. Out of roughly 650 men who had entered the ravine, over 200 were killed or wounded. Many more suffered injuries that would remain permanent. The survivors were exhausted, malnourished, and psychologically frayed. Their uniforms were torn, faces streaked with mud, soot, and blood, bearing witness to days of relentless combat. Yet the battalion had achieved what the broader operational plan could not guarantee. They had held a critical sector of the Argonne against repeated German attacks. Their endurance had fixed enemy forces in place, preventing German units from reallocating to oppose the advancing Allies elsewhere along the front. The tiny pocket of resistance had slowed, distracted, and depleted a larger, well-prepared force. Major Whittlesey and his surviving officers were commended for their leadership under conditions that defied doctrine. Their decisions, calculated, disciplined, and unyielding, had preserved as much of the battalion as possible while maximizing the tactical effect on the enemy. The Americans had held the line not through reckless heroism, but through controlled, unbroken discipline. German commanders, for their part, recognized the unexpected cost of the engagement. Their careful strategy of encirclement and attrition had been disrupted by the battalion's cohesion. The failure to eliminate the isolated unit quickly represented both a tactical and psychological setback. Contemporary accounts describe German officers as stunned by the Americans' capacity to endure. Letters from German soldiers note repeated astonishment, small groups holding ground far longer than anticipated, repelling attacks despite being cut off from reinforcement, even under friendly fire from misdirected artillery. "We could not believe it," one memoir records. "Every attempt to finish them only drew more blood from us." For the men themselves, the aftermath was complex. Many returned home physically scarred and psychologically altered. Post-war reports detail lingering anxiety, nightmares, and survivor's guilt. Yet, despite trauma, there was also an unspoken pride in what they had accomplished. They had endured the unforgiving forest, repelled repeated assaults, and maintained cohesion under conditions that could have easily shattered them. Recognition came not only through medals and commendations, but also through public attention. Newspapers, journals, and military bulletins recounted the story of the lost battalion, with emphasis on discipline and heroism under extreme conditions. The narrative reinforced an emerging image of the U.S. Army as a disciplined, resourceful, and resilient force, capable of holding its own against veteran adversaries. In the weeks following the battalion's relief, the U.S. Army worked to integrate the lessons of the Argonne engagement into doctrine and training. Reports emphasized the fragility of coordination in dense terrain, the importance of redundant communication systems, and the psychological toll of isolation on troops. The ordeal of the Lost Battalion became a case study, a vivid illustration of how leadership, discipline, and endurance could offset overwhelming odds, even when every material advantage seemed lost. Major Charles Whittlesey emerged from the forest as a figure of quiet authority. Decorated with the Medal of Honor, he embodied a style of command that prioritized clarity, calm, and presence under fire. His subordinates credited him not for inspiration through words, but for modeling composure amidst chaos. Officers and enlisted men alike had witnessed firsthand the difference that measured decisions could make in survival. Whittlesey's insistence on maintaining the perimeter, even as German assaults intensified, became an enduring lesson in tactical restraint and situational awareness. The battalion's survival also demonstrated the critical role of logistics and supply. Ammunition conservation, rationing of food and water, and the meticulous distribution of resources under stress allowed a fraction of the original force to maintain an effective fighting capacity. The Americans had adapted not only to enemy pressure, but to the constraints of their own equipment, a dual challenge that few units of the time had faced so directly. On the German side, the failure to eliminate the pocket had tangible operational consequences. Time and resources expended against the Lost Battalion delayed reinforcements to other sectors, contributing to broader setbacks across the Argonne line. Contemporary accounts describe German officers as frustrated, often incredulous at the Americans' endurance. Letters from German soldiers note repeated astonishment, small groups holding ground far longer than anticipated, repelling attacks despite being cut off from reinforcement, even under friendly fire from misdirected artillery. "We could not believe it," one memoir records. "Every attempt to finish them only drew more blood from us." For the men themselves, the experience left indelible marks. Many suffered lingering injuries and trauma. Post-war reports detail nightmares, anxiety, and survivor's guilt. Yet there was also pride. Endurance, cohesion, and survival had become their defining achievements. Recognition came in medals, commendations, and public attention. Newspapers celebrated their quiet heroism. The story reinforced an emerging image of the U.S. Army as disciplined, capable, and resilient. Strategically, the battalion's endurance contributed to the success of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, fixing German forces in place and aiding broader Allied advances. The forest eventually reclaimed the traces of the engagement, shell craters filled with water, torn trees rotted into soil, and paths grew over. But the impact of those 7 days, the decisions, the endurance, the human cost, remained imprinted in military doctrine, public memory, and the personal histories of those who survived. The Lost Battalion's ordeal is not merely a story of survival. It is a study in human resilience, leadership, and the unforgiving nature of industrial warfare. In a world dominated by machine guns, artillery, and rigid plans, it was human will and disciplined decision-making that defined the outcome. The forest, the rain, the mud, and the constant threat of death stripped combat to its elemental truths: endurance, adaptation, and the relentless demand of duty. Major Whittlesey and his men did not act out of heroism in the theatrical sense. They acted because there was no alternative. Each man understood that their survival and the survival of their comrades depended on focus, composure, and shared responsibility. Their refusal to break, even as starvation, wounds, and bombardment weighed upon them, reshaped the expectations of what soldiers could endure and accomplish under extreme conditions. The broader significance of the engagement extends beyond the Argonne forest. It demonstrated that even relatively inexperienced troops, when properly led and disciplined, could influence the course of larger operations. It emphasized the importance of communications, logistics, and cohesion in a battlefield defined by uncertainty. For the Germans, it was a moment of misjudgment and surprise. A small group of Americans had held ground they expected to yield easily, forcing a recalculation of resources and strategy. In the decades that followed, the story of the Lost Battalion became emblematic of American participation in the First World War. It highlighted the contrast between industrial warfare's destructive machinery and the human element that could navigate, endure, and influence its outcome. Letters, diaries, and post-war accounts preserved the reality of fear, exhaustion, and loss, alongside discipline, courage, and quiet resolve. For modern audiences, the Argonne Forest serves as a reminder of the costs of conflict and the capabilities of those who face it. It teaches that endurance is not always visible in grand gestures or dramatic charges. Sometimes it is measured in the steadfast maintenance of position, the careful conservation of resources, and the refusal to yield under pressure. It illustrates that leadership is not always heroic speech, but calm decision-making under relentless stress. And it shows that history is shaped as much by those who hold as by those who advance. Ultimately, the Lost Battalion is a story of human limits tested and extended. It is a testament to soldiers who, surrounded and outnumbered, endured in the face of overwhelming odds, not for glory, but because their duty demanded it. In the quiet aftermath, when the forest reclaimed its shattered paths and the guns fell silent, what remained was the enduring mark of resilience, discipline, and the human capacity to withstand what should have been insurmountable.